When I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow, my heart stopped, because I knew, down to the marrow of my chilled bones, that it wasn't a person. I was 14, belly only beginning to swell, every choice I'd ever made echoing like a curse behind me. Mama's voice, "Get out and don't come back," still burned my ears, sharper than the wind that sliced my cheeks raw. I ran until the village lights vanished, until the pines swallowed the moon, until I couldn't tell if the wet on my face was tears or melting snow. The forest at night wasn't quiet. It breathed. Limbs groaned, flakes whispered across drifts, and somewhere an owl gasped out a single, solemn warning. I kept stumbling forward, telling myself I'd find a road, a barn, a miracle, anything, before dawn froze me solid. That's when the steps came again, soft, deliberate, heavy enough to belong to something with power in its shoulders. I spun, lantern-eyed, and saw him. A lone wolf stood barely 20 paces away, silver where the snow caught his coat, dark where the shadows pooled. No snarl, no low throat rumble, just the slow rise and fall of his breath and the unblinking weight of his gaze. In that gaze I felt measured, like a brittle twig deciding whether it would snap underfoot. My knees unlocked without permission, dropping me to the drift. Every story I'd ever heard, wolves chase scent of blood, wolves taste fear, rushed through me, and I tasted iron behind my teeth. He took one step closer. The pad of his paw settled so lightly I heard individual crystals fracture. I was sure he would devour me right there, spill what little life I carried onto the snow. But the blow never came. He halted, tilted his head, ears pricking as though he were listening to something beyond either of us. Then, unthinkably, he sat, just folded onto his haunches like a patient sentry, tail coiling over his feet. The breath I'd been holding burst out like steam. The strange stillness stretched. I could see the puffs of vapor between his jaws. They matched my own in tempo, two hearts ticking inside the same cold clock. I whispered, "Please," not sure if I was begging him to leave or to stay. A quiver ran along his flank, but he didn't move. Snowflakes kept falling, soft as whispers on confession night. One landed on his muzzle. He blinked and let it melt. Something about that single blink thawed the ice around my terror. He wasn't crouched to spring. He looked curious. Curious about the foolish girl who'd wandered so deep, so late, with nothing but the thin cotton coat she'd been born in. I pushed to my feet, wobbling. He rose too, mirroring me. For one wild second, I imagined we were reflections of each other, both outcasts under the same indifferent sky. My throat tightened. "I need shelter," I muttered, more to the trees than to him. He answered by taking 3 strides sideways, then glancing back, as if marking a trail only he could see. I didn't dare believe it, yet my boots followed. He trod a faint line through knee-high powder, pausing whenever I faltered, always keeping that measured distance. Once I slipped and cried out, he wheeled, hackles bristling at the darkness behind us, and I realized he'd put his body between mine and whatever else prowled the woods. He looked at me as though I mattered. Minutes, or maybe hours, time had lost its hands, passed before the tree line cracked open to reveal an abandoned trapper's shack. The roof sagged under snow, but the walls stood, and right then, it felt grander than any palace. The wolf stopped at the edge of the clearing. He didn't follow as I lurched to the crooked door. He only watched, eyes glowing like twin coals banking against the wind. Inside, the air smelled of old pine pitch and mouse nests. I dropped onto a splintered bench, body shaking from more than cold. Through a gap in the boards, I could still see him, a silent statue outlined in moon dust. I tried to meet his stare, tried to offer gratitude with nothing but a nod. The wolf lowered his head once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging a pact neither of us yet understood. Then he turned and melted back into the pines. If the story ended there, perhaps I could convince myself it was fever or fright painting shapes in the dark. But the forest had only opened its first page, and I was no longer merely lost. I was being read by something older than language. I didn't know it yet, but the night had chosen its witness, and I was her. When dawn seeped through the warped boards of the shack, I half believed the wolf had been a dream, but outside, the snow told his story better than any witness. A single line of paw prints, wide and deliberate, circling the clearing before melting into the pines. He had stood guard while I slept. The thought made my throat burn with something that tasted like hope and fear mixed together. By late afternoon, the cold crept through every crack, so I hauled broken branches inside, fed them to the rust-scarred stove, and listened to the forest breathe. I told myself he wouldn't return. Wolves roam, they don't linger. Still, as the light bled out of the sky, I found my gaze glued to the door. Footsteps, softer than the first night, but unmistakable. My pulse stuttered. I eased the door open, and there he was, shadow against shadows, keeping the same cautious distance. A single drift of breath curled from his muzzle, then vanished. I whispered, "Thank you," though I doubted he cared for words. He lowered his head once, like a polite stranger tipping a hat, and retreated to the tree line. He simply watched. Minutes, maybe hours. Time was a frayed ribbon until the moon climbed high. Only when I staggered back inside to keep the fire alive did I realize how fiercely I'd been shivering, not from the cold, but from the mystery of him. Morning brought a new sign. Just beyond the threshold lay a fresh-killed hare, still warm enough to steam. No tooth marks, no torn hide, only a neat crimson bloom where his jaws had ended its heartbeat. I knelt, fingers trembling over soft fur. A sentence burst out of me, raw and certain. He didn't eat it himself. He left it for me. My stomach twisted. Hunger wrestled with disbelief. I skinned the animal with shaking hands, cooked the meat slow, and swallowed around lumps of gratitude that felt too big for my chest. All day, I built a barrier of logs inside the shack, telling myself it was for warmth, not because the gift terrified me more than the dark. Dusk returned. So did he. This time he padded closer, 2 steps nearer than before, then lay down in the snow, forepaws crossed like a dog waiting for its master. I could see the soft pulse in his throat, the twitch of one ear at every distant creak. For a long while we stared across the thin air, prisoner and guard unsure which role belonged to which. When I finally spoke, my voice cracked. "Why me?" The forest answered with silence. He blinked once, slow as falling ash, and I swear the weight of that gaze pressed an answer into my bones. "Because you're alone." I thought that was the whole miracle, a single mercy carved out of winter. I even dared believe the story was finished, until the next night. Snow fell thick, erasing our earlier tracks. He appeared as a gray ghost at the edge of the lantern glow and nudged something forward with his muzzle. Another hare, still untouched. I gasped so sharply it hurt. He backed away, not running, just surrendering space like it belonged to me. I knelt, tears freezing on my lashes. 2 nights, 2 gifts. Coincidence lost its grip. This felt intentional, almost sacred. If your heart is hammering now, if you feel the tremor of that unspoken promise, subscribe to this channel. Some truths of the wild fade if no one carries them. Stay, and we'll keep them alive together. I cleaned the second hare, thanked him aloud, and laid the bones outside in repayment I knew he'd never need. While the meat simmered, I caught myself humming a lullaby Mama used to sing before everything shattered. The cabin smelled of broth, smoke, and distant comfort. For the first time since exile, my unborn child kicked, reminding me life still chose to fight. But peace is a thin sheet over deep water. Past midnight, a branch cracked far off, followed by a low grunt, the heavy, rooting noise of wild boar. The wolf's ears speared forward. He stood, muscles flowing under fur, and fixed those amber eyes on the dark between trees. One step, then another, until his outline dissolved into night. I waited for a scream, a clash, any sign, yet the forest swallowed all sound. Minutes stretched like wire. I caught myself praying, not to a god, but to the wolf. Ridiculous, yet every cell believed he could hear. Silence held. I thought whatever danger lurked had drifted on, but dawn would show hoof gouges in the snow beside his tracks, and something deep in me would buckle under the weight of what he'd faced for my sake. That, however, is tomorrow's burden. Tonight ends with me curled by the embers, one hand on my stomach, the other on the wolf fur blanket I do not own, listening, always listening, for the soft return of footsteps that mean I am not alone after all. When the third dusk slipped into the trees and he appeared again, tail flicking snow like sparks, I realized silence was choking me more than cold. I had lived 14 years surrounded by people whose every breath hummed with opinion. Now the forest absorbed my thoughts before they reached my lips. Something in me begged to break that hush, to pour words into the only living thing that hadn't turned away. I knelt inside the doorway, elbows on my knees, and spoke so softly, the lantern flame barely quivered. "I don't know your name." The wolf's ears tilted forward. He stayed where moonlight rimmed his shoulders, but I felt the weight of his attention as surely as if he'd laid a paw on my chest. "Mine's Ivy," I whispered, giving him the first truth I'd offered any soul since exile. The trees answered with a hush of snow sliding off branches. He sank to the ground, legs folding under like water settling into a hollow. That single act, choosing to rest, not hunt, cleaved my fear in half. I shuffled out, blanket around my shoulders, and sat against the shack wall. Between us lay maybe 10 paces of untouched powder, yet I felt a line of warmth stretch from his ribs to mine, as if a hidden fire pulsed through both bodies. "You saved me," I said. My voice cracked, and shame washed up, guilt for leaning on a creature who owed me nothing. No one else would. The wolf blinked, slow and deliberate. Stars glittered in his eyes. I'd always been told wolves were yellow-eyed devils. Tonight I saw only deep pools that caught galaxies like nets. Words tumbled out. I told him about the night Mama slammed the door, about the ring of frozen lanterns on the porch, about the way neighbors' curtains twitched when I passed. I confessed my terror of the child inside me, how each flutter felt like a promise I wasn't strong enough to keep. Snow absorbed tears before they reached my chin. The wolf just listened, breath pluming steady, the metronome of a heart I could borrow. Somewhere during my confession, a wind rose, flinging pine scent between us. He lifted his muzzle and tasted the air but didn't stand. Instead, he rested his head on crossed paws, a gesture so domestic it split something tender open inside me. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," I murmured, truth lighting my words like embers. "You're here." That sentence settled around us like fresh snowfall, soft, undeniable, impossible to retract. My skin prickled, not with cold, but with the strange certainty that he understood at least the music, if not the meaning. The forest seemed to draw nearer, as if eavesdropping on a language older than either of us. Minutes passed, maybe hours. My jaw ached from talking, yet I couldn't stop. Silence felt like betrayal now. I described the first kick I'd felt that morning, how it startled me so badly I dropped a log into the fire. I laughed, a raw, startled sound. The wolf's ears flicked, and his tail brushed the snow once, quick as a heartbeat. Moon climbed higher, frost silvered my blanket. Still, he didn't leave. I felt heat radiate from his presence, a pulse that reached beneath skin to settle my racing blood. In the gaps between stories, the night hummed. Distant owl hoot, crackle of sap freezing, drip of melting icicles. All ordinary sounds, yet threaded with the delirious awareness that I was no longer alone on this edge of the earth. At last my words dried up. I hugged my knees and laid my cheek on them, watching each cloud of breath drift toward him. He watched back, eyelids drooping, as though fighting the same drowsy peace that slid over me. In that hush, I heard the steady two-step of our combined heartbeats, mine quick and jittery, his deep and slow, blending into a single, lulling drum. I must have dozed. I woke with a start when snow sagged off the roof in a muffled thud. The wolf's head snapped up. He eyed the darkness, then shifted his gaze to me. His look held a question. "Are you all right?" I nodded, tears stinging for no reason I could name. He lowered his head again, and for the first time I noticed a faint scar along his muzzle, a pale line that caught starlight like a thread of ice. I wondered who had hurt him, who had cast him into solitude, and whether he felt the same relief in my presence that I felt in his. I thought that night was the final miracle, the crest of some gentle wave that would carry us safely to shore. I thought the worst was behind us. But one evening, not long after, he didn't come, and the dark felt wider than the sky. The forest changed when he vanished. Day one without him, the pines felt taller, the night colder, every crack of twig an omen. I told myself he was ranging for food, that wolves moved like tides. Day two, wind scraped the roof till dawn and shadows clung to the windows like stains. Still no sign. By the third dusk, my bravado collapsed. I pushed the stove hotter, trying to boil fear the way you boil water, fiercely, uselessly, loud enough to drown your own thoughts. That's when the ground began to shake. Low grunts drifted through the cracks, wet, guttural, too heavy for deer. Snow outside churned with dark shapes, wild boars, bigger than the farm hogs I'd slopped as a child, shoulders humped with muscle, tusks sweeping moonlight. The largest pawed the drift, snout flaring. He smelled the broth I'd spilled, the fear I couldn't hide. Instinct hurled me upward. I scrambled onto the rickety loft, pressed my spine against the rafters, and clamped a hand over my belly. The boards below groaned as one boar shoved the door. Rot splintered, hinges shrieked. They stormed inside, clattering against the cast-iron stove, overturning my meager stores. Steam hissed where a pot crashed, and the scent of meat flared. An invitation and a fuse. I clung to a beam, every heartbeat a drum in my throat. If they reared, they'd reach me. If the floor broke, I'd fall among tusks. I pictured the end, a gasp, a spray of crimson, another secret lost in snow. Then the night ripped open with a single soaring howl. It rolled through the shack like thunder in reverse, power rushing inward, shaking dust from the rafters. The boars froze. A second howl, closer, sharper, split the dark. Snow exploded beyond the broken doorway as my wolf charged. A silver streak lit by fury. He hit the lead boar shoulder first. The crash rattled my bones. Boar and wolf tumbled. Snarls and squeals fused into one savage chord. Another boar lunged. He wheeled, teeth flashing, raking its flank. Tusks slashed, missed, slashed again. He ducked, snapped, drove them backward step by brutal step until they faced him in the clearing, hackles high, breath steaming like engines. I could only watch, helpless, as the largest boar charged once more. Wolf met it head-on, jaws clamping the thick neck just above the shield of bone. Snow fountained. The boar heaved, trying to fling him off, but he held fast, muscles bunched like braided steel. A heartbeat later, the second boar fainted at his hindquarters. He released, spun, and nipped its ear so deep I saw the flash of cartilage. That broke something. Maybe courage, maybe pride. They wheeled as one and thundered into the trees, their crash receding down the slope. The clearing fell silent but for my pulse roaring in my ears. He stood alone in trampled snow, sides heaving. Moonlight limned new cuts along his shoulder, blood beaded, dark and thick, then vanished against his coat. He turned, searching until his eyes found mine through the loft slats. He stood between me and death. Just a beast, But he did. My limbs unlocked. I climbed down, knees shaking, and stepped into the doorway. Cold flogged my cheeks, but the sight of him burned hotter than any fire. I whispered his name, the one I'd been too shy to speak before. Silver. He lifted his head, ears forward, as if the syllable mattered. Slowly, carefully, I knelt. He closed half the distance, stopped, and lowered to his belly, nose resting on his paws. Between us lay churned snow and spilled kindling, but also something larger, proof carved in blood and hoofprints that I was, somehow, his to protect. I wanted to thank him, to press my palms against that bristled fur, to tend every wound. Instead I whispered, "Stay," knowing wild things don't obey. He watched the tree line a long moment, air fogging around the torn edge of his ear. Only when the forest settled did he rise. He gave one small shake, snow dusted off like ash, then limped toward the pines. "Wait," I called, voice tiny in the endless dark. He paused at the shadow's edge, glanced back. Our eyes locked, and I felt the gravity of a promise unspoken. I am not gone, I am only needed elsewhere. Then he vanished, silent as falling snow. I stood there long after, the cold biting harder now that his heat had retreated. On the ground, a single gray hair curled among hoof-gouged drifts. I slipped it into my pocket, an amulet against nightmares. I thought that victory meant the danger was over, that after such a battle, the forest would grant us peace. I thought the night had spent all its monsters, but fate was still turning the page, and the next line was already written in blood. I woke the morning after the boars with a strange, defiant thing fluttering in my chest. Hope. It felt too bright for the shack's dim light, yet it refused to shrink. I'd survived. The baby kicked strong, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a wounded wolf still roamed. If a beast could choose mercy, maybe the world hadn't finished with me after all. That afternoon, I cleared snow from the doorway to let in sun. While I worked, I spoke aloud, pretending Silver lounged just beyond the drifts. I told him how Mama used to braid my hair so tight my eyes watered, how Papa sang off key when harvest beer flowed, how both looked through me like smoke the night they sent me away. My voice shook, but the forest listened, and in its hush I heard his phantom paws pacing. Near twilight, he returned, limping, yes, but upright, muzzle dusted white. I exhaled a prayer I hadn't known I was holding. He stopped at the boundary he always respected, yet tonight his ears tipped forward as if the distance bothered him. I sat on the stump I'd dragged close to the door and poured everything out, the terror of the coming birth, the crooked dream that someday I'd raise my child where no one called her a sin. Words spilled faster than breath. He watched, head tilted, amber eyes steady, and I felt more heard than in any church pew. I showed him my only relic from home, Mama's thimble on a thread. He leaned in, nostrils flaring, then exhaled over the metal like blessing it. The gesture shattered me. I whispered, "You look at me like I'm yours." And the warmth of that sentence lit the cold air. Snow began again, soft fat flakes landing on his lashes. He shook them off, and for the first time, eased one step closer. My pulse sprinted. He settled on his belly, distance halved, tail curled neatly. The stove inside crackled. Outside, silence wrapped us like wool. I kept talking, about names I'd considered for the baby, about a cabin with real glass windows I'd build someday. Each confession loosened a knot in my chest. His eyes flickered, calm and intent, as though memorizing every syllable. Night thickened. Exhaustion seeped through my bones. I dragged the blanket around my shoulders and leaned against the doorframe, words slowing to murmurs. Snow muted the world, leaving only the soft rhythm of his breath. My eyelids drooped. Somewhere far off an owl called, but it sounded gentle, not ominous. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the dark. He was here. I must have drifted. When a log popped in the stove, I jerked awake, heart hammering. The blanket had slipped. Frost nipped exposed skin. I looked for him, expecting the same respectful gap, but he lay 3 feet away, chin on paws, his flank rising and falling in slow, even waves. He had closed the distance while I dreamed. Heat rolled from his body, meeting my shivers halfway. The gesture cracked something wider than fear, an impossible trust bridging species and sorrow. I whispered his name. One ear twitched. He didn't lift his head, just let a rumble vibrate deep in his chest, less a growl than a note of acknowledgement. I eased down onto the snow beside him. He didn't flinch. I could see the fine scars on his muzzle, the snowflakes melting against his fur, the soft twitch of whiskers as he scented my breath. The baby kicked, and instinctively I placed my hand over the movement. His gaze followed the gesture. For a breathless second, we shared that secret thump beneath my skin. Tears blurred the moon. The night stretched, gentle and terrifying in its beauty. I spoke quieter now, telling him about the lullaby Mama once sang, promising I'd sing it again when the child arrived. He blinked slow, lids heavy, and I felt the magnet of sleep pull at my own spine. I laid my head on the blanket-wrapped knees, breath sinking to his deeper rhythm. Between one heartbeat and the next, worry loosened its claws. Moon slid beyond the treetops. My eyes fluttered open just long enough to see him lift his head, nose tasting the wind, as if checking the borders of a kingdom only he could sense. Satisfied, he settled again, this time so close his warmth seeped straight through wool and skin to the tiny life inside me. Snow kept falling, erasing every line the world used to hold us apart. I began to believe this peace could last, that the wild itself had offered a forever guardian. I thought he would stay, night after night, until the baby's first cry echoed back his first howl. But the forest writes its own vows, and morning always turns the page. The pain struck at dawn, swift, deep, unlike any cramp I'd known. It doubled me as I carried wood to the stove, breath fogging the frosted glass I'd patched with oiled paper. A second wave followed, sharper, stealing sound from the room. Even the crackle of the fire seemed to vanish behind the roar of my pulse. "No, not yet," I whispered, palms braced on the table. Snow still sealed every path, the nearest village miles away. Another jolt tore through me and dropped me to my knees. My hands flew to my belly, the swell hard as knotted rope. Panic tunneled my vision. Alone, the word throbbed under my ribs. I crawled toward the bed of pine boughs, sweating despite the cold, each contraction a stone grinding inside me. I fumbled for the blanket, for courage, for anything that felt like help. The door scraped. I twisted, half delirious, and saw him fill the gap. Silver, limping, coat matted with ice, and a dark smear of blood along his flank. He crossed the threshold despite the stove's heat, despite the human darkness that should have repelled him. The door swung shut behind his tail as if the wind obeyed him. I couldn't speak. He took 3 slow steps and stopped, eyes locked on mine. The room shrank to that gaze, steady, unblinking, anchoring me while pain tried to drown everything else. He lowered his head, ears angled forward, a silent question. "What do you need?" Another contraction crushed words into a groan. I rolled to my side, knees drawing up, sweat chilled on my temples. He moved closer, only a foot of air between us now, and lay down, forepaws stretched like a guardian at a threshold no monster would cross. Blood trickled from a gash on his shoulder, but he didn't flinch, didn't lick the wound. His whole being focused on me, time fragmented. I remember the smell of wood smoke and pine pitch, the steady drip of meltwater from the eaves, the rough weave of the blanket clutched in my fists. Contractions surged faster, each one ripping a hoarse cry from my throat. With every scream, Silver's ears flicked, and he edged nearer as if trading distance for my pain. When I braced against the next wave, my forehead brushed his fur, hot, bristled, real. He looked straight into me, and I felt the message wordless and clear. "You are not alone. I am here." Labor blurred into a long red twilight. I panted, pushed, prayed. At one point, The world tilted, and black spots swarmed my eyes. I sagged forward. Silver thrust his head under my arm, propping me upright with the rough mantle of his neck. I clung to him, fingers buried in thick winter coat, letting the heat of his body seep into my bones. He held steady, a living wall, while agony ripped through me again. Minutes, hours, I lost track until the pressure changed, sliding low and urgent. Instinct took over. I bore down, throat raw, and the shack filled with a sound that wasn't mine alone, a thin, wet wail, shrill as a winter wind. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then relief crashed over me so fierce I sobbed. A daughter lay between my shaking thighs, slick and red, lungs already protesting the cold. My hands trembled so hard I feared dropping her. Silver thrust his muzzle close, nostrils flaring at the scent of new life. I tensed, but his tongue touched the blood-smeared cord with deliberate gentleness, cleaning what I couldn't reach. I finished the task with rusty knife and trembling prayers, wrapped the tiny body in linen, drew her to my chest. Silver sat back, watching, chest still rising quick from exertion, or maybe from awe. I lifted my daughter so he could see. Her cries softened to hiccups, dark eyes blinking at lantern light. Silver's ears flattened in what felt like wonder. He stretched his neck, nose stopping inches from her face. She inhaled, fell silent, staring at the wolf who had heard her first breath. He became a bridge between the wild and my child. Blood pooled beneath him. His shoulder wound had reopened. "You need rest too," I whispered, tears hot on my cheeks. He merely laid his head on his paws, eyes never leaving us. Fire popped, casting sparks that swirled like fireflies. Outside, dawn crawled up the trunks, turning snow to pale gold. Exhaustion dragged at me, but jubilation kept my heart hammering. I rocked my daughter, humming a threadbare lullaby, Silver's steady breath the drumbeat beneath it. When I heard my baby's cry, I thought it was the end of danger, the closing of every terrible chapter. I was wrong. By the second dawn after the birth, hunger clawed so fiercely I feared my milk would dry. The forest, draped in blinding snow, offered nothing but silence, until Silver padded from the pines, with a fresh killed grouse clamped tenderly between his jaws. He crossed the clearing, gait stiff from the wound at his shoulder, and laid the bird on the threshold. The gesture held a solemn weight, not hunting, but giving. I whispered thanks, tears stinging because gratitude felt too small to contain what he'd done. When I bent to retrieve the grouse, the baby whimpered inside the sling against my chest. Silver's ears twitched toward the sound. His eyes softened into something I can only call reverence. I cooked the meat over a slow flame, the scent of roasted skin threading through pine smoke. When I tasted the first bite, a rush of salt, iron, and wild, I felt strength bloom behind my ribs. My daughter suckled, eyes drifting shut, cheeks flushed warm. Silver watched from the doorway, breath fogging the air, tail sweeping snow in a patient rhythm. He wasn't watching me, he was watching her, as though he knew everything, every struggle, every wound was for her. That night I wrapped my fingers around a thin strand of memory and wove it into words. "You're my brother now," I told him. "Blood doesn't always come from the same womb." The title felt audacious, but the way his ears tipped forward, neither protest nor dismissal, made courage swell in my throat. On the third dawn, he returned with something greater, half a hindquarter of deer. The drag marks behind him cut a crimson path through the snow. He left the offering outside, but lingered, head low, ribs hitching with each breath. I stepped out, palms up, heart knocking so loud even the baby stirred. "You can rest," I said, though he could not understand syllables. Yet some message must have crossed the gap. He sank onto his belly, muzzle resting on crossed paws, amber eyes dim with fatigue. I knelt beside him. My daughter's tiny fist clung to my collar, her gaze flicking between the great wolf and the world newly born. My shaking hand hovered above Silver's head. He didn't flinch, only lifted his nose, nostrils filling with her scent, wordlessly asking. I lowered my fingers. His tongue swept once across my palm, rough, hot, startling. A single seal pressed onto the frail parchment of our bond. My throat closed. I had touched a miracle, and the miracle had touched back. Silver exhaled, gaze still fixed on the baby. I understood then he was promising her the wilderness itself, carved free and delivered warm. My tears fell fast. They speckled his fur like new snow, and he did not shake them off. 3 evenings in a row he arrived, gifts laid at my feet, rabbit, squirrel, 2 pheasants. Each time he stayed a little longer, edging close enough that the baby's curious fingers brushed his hackles. She gurgled, light, airy laughter that belonged in sunlight, not in a frost-bitten shack. Silver's head cocked, bemused. I laughed too, the sound foreign after weeks of whispers, and the cabin seemed to pulse with an impossible, shared heartbeat. I began to spin futures aloud. A garden for herbs, a porch where I'd mark her height, summers when she'd chase fireflies and hear this tale as bedtime gospel. Silver listened, all silent witness and patient breath, like the living page upon which those dreams could root. I started to think he would stay forever, returning each twilight until my daughter could toddle through snowdrifts and tug his tail in greeting. But wild promises are written in wind. On the 4th morning, no paw prints marred the fresh drift. I waited, breath clouding the empty doorway. Sunset bled across the sky. The edges of the clearing stayed pristine. No shadow slipped between the cedars. 2nd day, nothing but raven wings overhead. 3rd day, storm winds howled, erasing even yesterday's hope. I called his name into the gale, once, twice, until my voice cracked like ice, and the forest answered only with the moan of bending trunks. He was gone. The kingdom he'd lent me closed around its own silence, leaving a single line in the snow where he'd last stood, a line the wind refused to fill, as though memory itself had weight. And so night fell again, heavier than any before. I rocked my daughter beside the stove, humming the lullaby Mama once sang, every note a plea that the world might bring him back. But the forest had turned the page, and I could not yet read what waited on the next line. I have carried this story in silence for 34 winters, letting it throb behind my ribs like a second heart. Tonight, for reasons I can't fully name, the hush feels heavier than the telling, so I open my mouth at last and let the years stream out. My daughter, Rose, is 34 now. She is bright the way starlight is bright on new snow, sharp, clean, impossible to smother. She teaches biology at a rural college, invites her students to track carnivore scat in the backcountry, and laughs whenever a city kid panics at wolf prints. Her house is full of field guides, half-healed songbirds, and sketches of canids pinned above the fireplace. She says wolves taught her tenderness before humans could explain the word, though she doesn't remember the night a real one stood sentinel over her first breath. I remember everything, and for the first time, I will say his name aloud. Gray. I named him silently that long ago winter, too afraid that speaking would break the magic. Gray, for the silver in his coat and the color of the dawn he always chose for departure. Gray, for the mist that seemed to rise from his paws when he crossed fresh snow. Gray, because no other shade on earth holds such kindness and danger in the same breath. People ask how a girl of 14 survived a blizzard, a birth, and a forest thick with teeth. I feed them crumbs of truth, an abandoned shack, quick wits, God's mercy, and they nod, satisfied. But the whole loaf sits hidden inside me, a lone wolf, taper-eared and golden-eyed, who guarded me like a blood brother. How do you say that without watching belief drain out of the listener's face? Rose turned 6 when the nightmares stopped waking me. she would crawl into my bed during thunder, and I would hum the lullaby that carried her into this world. One humid night she asked, "Mama, why does the end of the song sound like a howl?" I froze, heart thudding in remembered darkness. Instead of answering, I told her a simple story about a brave wolf who protected a lost child. She fell asleep smiling. I lay awake till dawn, realizing the memory was no longer a wound but a seed, and it had begun to sprout. Years slipped past. I built a life of cedar beams and greenhouse glass. I grew lettuce in March, bottled jars of blackberry jam, and stitched quilt squares while Rose practiced Latin names for lichens. Yet every winter, when snow muffled the world and the stove cracked with sap, I would stand at the kitchen door and listen. Once, maybe 5, maybe 10 years after that first miracle, I heard a distant howl roll down the ridge. The sound twisted something sweet and painful in my chest. I pressed my palm to the cold pane and whispered, "Thank you, brother. We're still here." The howl never came again, but neither did the silence feel empty. It felt full of promise already kept. Rose grew tall, strong-legged, wild for moonlight hikes. On her 18th birthday, she asked for one gift, a camping trip into the same valley where she'd been born, though she didn't know the reason. We snowshoed in under a full moon, white pines glistening like cathedral columns. She climbed a boulder, threw back her head, and howled, high, shaky, joyful. Echoes fell away down the gorge. I didn't tell her my knees were shaking, because for a heartbeat I believed another voice would answer. None did. The valley merely held the echo, as if acknowledging a debt repaid. I've wondered, of course, what became of Gray. Wolves seldom live past 10. He would have slipped into the earth long before Rose lost her baby teeth. Maybe he found a pack, sired pups whose descendants still run those ridges. Maybe he died alone beneath the northern lights. Or maybe, and this is the thought that keeps me warmest, on the morning he vanished, he limped to a hidden den and rested at last, satisfied that the fragile lives he'd guarded were ready to stand. People who know I favor wolves call it sentimentality. They haven't felt a rough tongue seal a promise on a terrified girl's palm. They haven't watched a predator place food at a human doorstep, untouched. They haven't seen amber eyes focus not on the mother, but on the infant, as if recognizing the true heir to all the sacrifices. Gray looked at Rose that night, with a softness that changed the map of my heart. He wasn't seeing me, he was seeing her. As though he understood, everything I endured, he endured for her. Sometimes, when the world feels grimmer than that wolf-shadowed shack ever did, doubt slips in. Could it have been something else? Someone else? A fever? A dream? But then memory rises. Thick smell of wet fur, weight of his coat under my fingers, pressure of his shoulder against mine while life tore its way free, and I know the truth. It was a wolf, lone, kind, and he knew what he was doing. He knew everything. If your pulse is thundering right now, if you feel the hush of snow and the echo of a forgotten howl, subscribe to the channel. Here we preserve the moments when nature saves us, even after people fail. And if your heart is full of awe at this story, write in the comments, "Nature is wiser than us."